Today we're going to learn about the history of segregation and racist policy in Rochester. It's important to understand that individual racism is when you have a personal prejudice or a bias where you treat someone differently because of the color of their skin when you do it. Structural racism is when a government or a group or a school creates laws, policies, or practices that negatively hurt communities of color, whether or not the individuals don't like people because of their skin color. The policies and the laws and the practices end up hurting people of color. These things include housing segregation, different drinking fountains, not being allowed to vote because of your skin color, and being forced to attend segregated schools. Today we're going to learn about how segregation and structural racism happened in Rochester through the real estate industry when people tried to rent and buy houses, through restrictive covenants when people weren't able to buy houses, and redlining, another practice we'll talk about. This is Howard Coles, and he was the editor of the Frederick Douglass Voice Black newspaper in Rochester, New York. He did a study on the ways that people of color were mistreated when they moved to Rochester. In his report, he stated that there are numerous apartments and houses which people of color can't rent because certain big real estate agencies set an example of refusing to rent to them. A real estate agent is someone whose job it is to help people find and buy a house or to rent. Now, after his report, the city of Rochester realized there was a problem, so they hired a professor named Harold Rand to go through and do an even bigger study. And what Harold Rand found was that over half of the houses or apartments in the two neighborhoods that black people were allowed to live in Rochester were not safe for people to live in. During this time, the National Association of Real Estate Boards, which was a nationwide organization, the men who sold homes to people, they had to follow rules to keep their jobs, and one rule they had to follow was to make sure they never sold homes to black people in white neighborhoods. They had to do this whether they personally were prejudiced against black people or not. Frank Drum in the picture was in charge of this racist rule in Rochester. Restrictive covenants. All across the city of Rochester and the suburbs like Brighton, Pittsford, Penfield, Irondequoit, and Henrietta, there were special rules written into legal documents that proved a person owned their land once they bought their house. One of these rules is called a restrictive covenant. A restrictive covenant, is a rule that says that no people of color will legally be allowed to buy or live in the house above the land. In Brighton, 371 homes in the Meadowbrook neighborhood had this written into all the land under every house. It said, "No lot or dwelling shall be sold to or occupied by a colored person." And these were written by Kodak, who helped build these homes, and to all of these properties in the 1920s in Rochester. But the same practice happened in the 1930s as well. Builders like Fred Hills and Drum of Alliance Realty were encouraged by the government of the United States not to allow black people to buy the homes that they built. Here's a picture of a restrictive covenant that Fred Hills and Frank Drum wrote for the houses that surround Irondequoit High School. It says, "The dwelling shall be occupied by persons of the Caucasian race only." And here are a few other locations of restrictive covenants on the land that said that black people can't live there. And there's hundreds and thousands more around our community and in all cities across the country. Now, during this time, as you know, 1910 to 1970, we learned about it hopefully yesterday, the Great Migration. Now, between 1910 and 1970, millions of African Americans moved from the South to northern cities like Rochester. Many people of color in Rochester actually came from Sanford, Florida. They were hired to pick fruit in Webster, Wayne County, Brockport, and Hilton. Most families of color lived in cramped apartments in Rochester. They weren't allowed to own homes in Rochester during this time. During this time period, we also had a housing crisis. So in 1934, President Roosevelt helped pass a law that would help white people buy houses all across the United States, and several other laws increasing this law to spend more money to help build houses got passed in the following years. This is from the law. The law said that blacks and whites should be segregated and told builders and real estate agents to put restrictive covenants into the land that they built on. In order to keep white and black people separated, the government had maps made of almost every city in the U.S. Here's Rochester's map, made by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC. You can see a bunch more maps in New York State online. Now, the government created the Homeowners Loan Corporation to survey and rate neighborhoods in several northern cities and southern cities, including Rochester. Areas shaded red and yellow indicate that the government was less likely to back a mortgage because those areas were potentially dangerous, polluted, or had residents of color already living there. Here's what one of the survey forms a real estate agent used in the Cornhill neighborhood of Rochester. It was their job to count for Holk how many Negroes, that was the word in the form, lived in each neighborhood, so they'd know which areas to shade in red and to make sure white and black people wouldn't live near each other. The FHA only backed mortgages, loans for white people in blue and green parts of the city and for white people buying and building houses in the suburbs like Henrietta, Webster, Brighton, and Pittsford. This meant that white people could get money from the bank to live in the suburbs, but black people couldn't do that. The FHA and the VA, the Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Administration, insured half of all new mortgages nationwide across this time. This means that of all the people in the United States that bought a house, they were able to buy their house because the government helped give them money to do that. The FHA and VA, which are part of the federal government, gave out over $120 billion in mortgage insurance to help white people buy homes from 1934 to 1968. Over 35 million families benefited from these loans. 98% of them were white people. In 1958, people kept fighting back, like Howard Coles and Dr. Cooper, against these racist laws, and they helped get New York State's governor, Governor Harriman, to do a big report on how bad things were for people of color in Rochester. It was called Negroes in 5 New York Cities. The report said that 80% of people of color that lived in Monroe County lived in only 2 neighborhoods, the 3rd and the 7th Ward, which you can see in red on the map. The housing was very crowded in these neighborhoods. The report said that more than 1,600 units in both wards where the black people lived had either no bathrooms or shared bathrooms, and in more than 2,000 units there was more than one person living in each room. 30% of all of these apartments didn't have running water with them inside their units. No sinks, no toilets. The report said that no person of color in Monroe County was given one of these federal government FHA or VA loans for a mortgage in any new suburban development, including Henrietta. In 1950, only 57 families of color owned a home in a predominantly white neighborhood through private deals, personal friendships with white realtors, and personal friendships. 11 people of color lived in Henrietta in 1960, including Mr. and Mrs. Bias and Dr. Walter Cooper. They worked with anti-racist white people at the NAACP to secretly buy their houses in Henrietta. The Biases moved to Henrietta because when they tried to move to Irondequoit, white people kept throwing bricks through their windows to scare them away from living in their all-white neighborhoods. 16 families of color reported at that time that they faced abuse, ostracism, and the destruction of their homes from white people who were racist. The Ku Klux Klan is a white Protestant terrorist organization that tries to keep white and black people separate. In Rochester, a meeting of 8,000 Klan members had a big meeting in the 1920s. James and Alice Young in the 50s tried to buy a house in a white neighborhood. They received threats from the KKK saying they were going to burn their house down if they didn't move. Up until 1981, white people burned crosses in people of color's front yards right here in Henrietta on East River Road. By 1960s, things were getting pretty bad for people of color. They were so upset that many started to protest and some rioted. Rochester had a 3-day riot in 1964 because of the bad housing conditions, segregation, and problems with police dogs. The president did a big report on what the problem was. The report said our nation is moving towards 2 societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. And the report said something had to be done to stop segregation in housing and to help black people buy homes, or else more riots were going to happen. But white people across the country and in New York didn't want to pass a civil rights law that allowed white and black people to live in desegregated neighborhoods. But after Martin Luther King was assassinated, the president and his fellow lawmakers realized they had to do something. They made a law called the 1968 Fair Housing Act. Sadly, the law wasn't a strong law and has only been enforced a few times. The law says that if you're a person of color who can't buy a house because of your skin color, you have to find a lawyer and spend a lot of money and prove before a judge that you've been discriminated against. President Nixon even told the people working for him to never enforce this law. Ed Doherty works for the Rochester Area Community Foundation, and he's an expert in housing and the causes of poverty in Rochester. He says that the strong attitudes and policies that encourage racial and ethnic segregation here had and continue to have a profound and important impact on our community. When you look at this map, you can see that in those redlined areas is where the greatest amount of people of color in Rochester still live. When you overlay it with that redlining map, you can see a direct relationship between where people were forced to live in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and where people who are black still mostly live today. The blue dots, each blue dot stands for 200 black people, and each green dot stands for 200 white people. Population in redlined areas today is 92% still minority. Where people own homes today in Rochester, you can see people in the lighter areas are the areas where people don't own their houses, and in the darker areas, you can see it's where people own houses. You can see that where most people who are black live in Rochester, they don't own houses because of the redlining policies. You can also see that where the most poor people live are in the same places where the government forced people of color to live back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Another big problem that not allowing people of color to buy houses for almost 30 to 40 years is that people weren't allowed to build wealth. Wealth is how much money a person or a family is worth. The median white family in 2011 was worth over $111,000, while black families, their median worth was only $7,000. That's a big problem that scientists call a wealth gap. Another way to think about the wealth gap is this. For every $100 an average white family has in wealth, the average black family has 5. Redlining and segregation have led to where we live having the highest rate of child poverty, where children who are black are 4 times as likely as white children to live in poverty, where the median income of African Americans is less than half of that of whites in Monroe County, and both African Americans and Latinos are less than half as likely to own their own home as their white counterparts. Hopefully this presentation has helped you understand how segregation and structural racism